please? Thank you so much. Okay, so we have another geographer, happy times. Isaura Becker is a geographer from the Universidad, Tarapacá in Chile. She is a PhD candidate in the social sciences program. She has a long experience studying common governance and conservation in the high mountain ecosystems of the Peatlands in Chile, working with communities who are pastoralists, and we will hear it all from her presentation. So thank you so much, Isaura, for being here. Please join me in welcome. Oh, she's a visiting scholar. We're so lucky to have her until March 15th.
Okay. Thank you very much all to be here today. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate a lot the opportunity to present in the Ostrom. And today I would like to share progress from my doctoral dissertation, which is part of a broader research agenda developed by the Andean project. And the SPIT project is an interdisciplinary research initiative that brings together physical geography, ecology, and critical social sciences to study the social and environmental dimensions of a particular type of wetland that grows in the Andes. These wetlands are locally known as bofedales. These are high Andean peatlands that grow between 10,000 to 17,000 feet above sea level, and they extend across the central Andes from southern Peru and Bolivia to northern Chile and Argentina. As you can see on the map, in Chile, they occupy a significant portion of the highlands of the hyperarid Atacama Desert. And these are vibrant and ecology strategic ecosystems. By forming peat, they can accumulate larger volumes of water, functioning as natural reservoirs. And they also play an important role in the global climate systems with a carbon capture capacity greater than that of Northern Hemisphere peatlands. So bofedales also are biodiversity niche and host endemic species, many of them at risk. And they also serve crucial social functions for highland communities since pre-Hispanic times, especially for camelid pastoralism of llamas and alpacas. So while it may look like natural, many bofedales are maintained, sometimes even created by Aymara communities. For example, the stones in this image were carefully placed by Aymara herders. And Aymara communities develop a diverse range of practices of management. One of the most widespread practices is the canal constructions, but also they practice rechampeo. Sorry, I don't have a translation for this word, but it's a technique that consists of moving peat to other places to expand the bofedal, as shown in this image. And in some cases, controlled burning is used to regenerate vegetation. And even many of commonly called traditional practices intersect with the installation of pipes of the use of machinery and wells. Ritual technologies are also used to ensure the reproduction of water, plants, and animals. However, for decades, these ecosystems have faced multiple threats. Perhaps the most known is the expansion of mining activities, especially copper mining, which demands large volumes of water. And another threat is change in precipitation and temperature patterns associated with climate change. Our team analyzed bofedal distribution in an area affected by copper mining by relying bofedal locations with the amount of water allocated to mining companies. They found that in areas with higher water extraction, vegetation productivity decreased. So within Andespeed, we have also documented less visible threats that emerge from human agency. For example, threats related to environmental conservation. Many bofedales are within protected areas where conservation policies and green imaginaries restrict pastoral practices by identifying them as harmful. Another factor is property regimes, which have generated change in traditional forms of management. In this case, the formalization of private property has produced conflicts and the loss of collective irrigation practices. This fence is an example, bufedal divided with different conservation conditions before the irrigation of all these common get divided. More recently, we have begun to explore how environmental racism affects these ecosystems. In contexts where the imposition of a single Chilean identity, along with imaginaries of modernity and development, stigmatize bufedal management as backwards. This contributes to abandonment of practices identified by migration processes linked to proletarization and lack of services in the Altiplano. More recently still, racism has also been directed at Latin diasporas crossing the Altiplano to enter Chile. We are currently researching how bofedales intersect with this bordering through nature process because the materiality of these wetlands is also affected, for example, through the construction of trenches to prevent the crossing. So, my dissertation is situated with this socio-natural assemblage of peat formation, which intertwines with cultural and power dynamics. It problematized bofedales as natural wetlands and invite us to explore understudied drivers of environmental transformation. This is something we can summarize well in one of the center's papers, where colleagues and faculty deepen in this discussion. And the invitation we make here is not made from abstraction. On the contrary, we make it in a radical material sense because we have documented how these ecosystems blurs the division between nature and culture. In doing so, bofedales pushes to rethink our usual analytical categories. And in that exercise, new questions emerge. One of them emerged from this observation. If bofedal biophysical dimensions are inseparable from management, and management are inseparable from social and power dynamics, it's not enough to say communities manage bofedales and then describe these practices, because that overlooks how social differences organize knowledge, decision-making, and responsibilities in management. In fact, we also identify this gap at the center. Colleagues conduct a systematic review of academic literature on bofedales and found they have been studied mainly by natural sciences. Understandable because they are fascinating ecosystems, but in many of those studies, the bofedal appears as an ecological system that exists by nature's whim. Even within the social sciences, management is not always considered. And communities has often been described as if they were socially homogeneous. So when I wanted to continue this exploration, a major lack of empirical evidence prevented me from understanding more about how social differences influence these ecosystems. So far, bofedales also invite us to ask how the social relations that shapes the management are themselves organized by processes of differentiation. Because the power asymmetries appearing in the bofedal are not natural or inevitable, they are constructed. They become naturalized in the same way that the bofedal itself often becomes naturalized. This has implication not only for how we understand bofedales, but also for how we study them. Methodologically, it means we cannot study bofedales only through remote sensing or hydrological analysis. We also need to get close to everyday life, to practices, conflicts, and silences, because it's in the everyday that difference and power asymmetries become naturalized. The bofedal is a space where each day a certain type of idea is reproduced about who has the right to access it, who decides how it's used, and which form of knowledge counts. At this point, I began engaging with feminist political ecology, a field that goes beyond asking how social different groups experience environmental change to examine how norms about gender, race, and belonging are themselves embedded in the function of nature. From these perspectives, what counts as natural or scarce is never neutral. It reflects and reinforces social hierarchies. This means my study is not primarily about identifying the difference between men and women, for example. Rather, feminist political ecology led me to ask how norms embedded in socio-ecological relations produce differences in the first place, including the differences between what counts as nature and what not, between who knowledge is legitimate, knowledge of the land is considered legitimate and who's not, and between who belongs to a territory and who is marked as out of place. This shift led me to a simple but important question: how we can understand difference if we do not first examine what is normal? Because differences do not exist on their own. They emerge when someone or something deviates from a norm that remains unquestioned. If we fail to examine that norm, risk accepting as natural has in fact been constructed. From there, I began to understand normality as a form of social organization that defines what is expected for different social positions. And those who do not fit within the frame of normality are marked as different, not because they inherently are, but because the frame itself produces that distinction. So my work builds from this perspective to examine how norms are constructed within socio-ecological relations and to make visible experiences that tend to remain outside official narratives. However, Andy Speed taught us something important. Nature is not a simple stage that receives the impact of human management. Water, climate, vegetation, there are also conditions and transform the practices of those who live there. They led me to ask, what if ecological changes are also changing who occupies the place of the normal and of the different? But to think that through, we need to engage with critical physical geography, which challenges the separation between natural and social landscapes. From that perspective, landscapes are not simply physical systems that human societies then inhabit or modify. They are produced through processes which hydrology, ecology, and climate intertwine with power relations, histories of colonialism, and inequality. So that to understand a wetland, a river, or a peatland requires reading both its biophysical dynamics and the political conditions that shapes them. So this led me to a concrete question: how the normalization of social differences shape the buffer management and how ecological transformation reconfigure those differences. And to answer this question, I set 3 goals. First, understand how normal is constructed in buffer management. Second, see how the normality distribute works, knowledge, and authority among different people. And third, analyze ecological change, how ecological change strain or reinforce those differences. But producing knowledge about normality possesses an important methodological challenge, because normality is rarely declared. It operates through repetition until it becomes an unquestioned norm. So to address this question, I need exactly what I mentioned earlier, to get close to everyday life, because it's there in the routine, in what no one explains, that normality reproduces itself without being declared. That is why ethnography is central in this research. It allowed me to accompany routes through the Bofedal, participate in volunteer activities, observe meetings, and have extensive conversation with herders. In short, to be there not only for measure or record, but to see how life is lived. And then is when this project became a bit of tongue twister, because Willing to unsettle my own methodological boundaries, I decided to add satellite remote sensing tools. I have to be honest, I'm not an expert on remote sensing, and part of what I will share today is also the story of someone learning to move in a field that is not originally hers. Specifically, I incorporate the Normalization Different Vegetation Index, an index that measures changes in vegetation cover from satellite imagery. In simple terms, it let us see from space whether a bufedal is greener or drier and how that has changed over time. The idea was let satellites and ethnography talks to each other, to what herders observes on the ground, to dialogue with what satellites data registers, and vice versa. But I'm still in that process, defining time series on what communities themselves have observed take time, and the data are still being analyzed. So today I will not share NDBA results, but I do want to share some of the potentialities and also some tensions and limits that emerge when you try to make remote sensing and ethnography converse. Later, I will show some concrete examples using the teamworks. So, to situate this research, it takes place in Colchane commune, the third largest bufedal in the Chilean Altiplano, located on the border between Chile and Bolivia. When I arrived to Colchane in 2022-2024, I thought I will study the production of gender differences in bufedal management. I have a clear initial question: how were management tasks distributed between men and women? But the field did what the field does. It displays my apparent clarity quite quickly, and in that first displacement, I recall a methodological principle shared by critical physical geography and feminist ethnography: let the field speak. Over time, I understood that within Aymara social organization, gender difference is not isolated from positions of age and kinship. And to understand normality, the field requires that I attend of those multiple differences and relations rather than focusing only on what men and women do. However, before I get to that, the field repeatedly spoke me to the changes in the territory, especially about how many people live in the Altiplano today. Many people agreed that in the past, bufedal management was carried out among families with participation from all generations. Channel cleaning, water canalization, and livestock care brought together different family lineage under principles as AINI, a principle of reciprocity that organized everyday Aymara practices. Today, those gatherings are exceptional. Management is no longer carried out among families. It's organized mainly by family lineage, and in some cases individually, because many people have left the territory. Therefore, fewer people engage in these activities. When I ask what could explain these changes, people say there are more conflicts between families, young people leave, or pastoralism is not longer liable. Colchane has in fact reduced its population significantly from 1,700 people in 2017 to 700 in 2024, representing a decline of more than 50% of the population. For example, in this case, a community that might appear populated today is inhabited by one person. So depopulation is not only linked to young people changing course, other processes push people to migrate. For example, restriction on commercializing camelid meat due to the lack of infrastructure to meet sanitary protocols. Process of proletarization when men shift to work in mining on transportation, often in shift system of work that keeps them away from territory for weeks or for months. And also, there are the late arrival of basic services such electricity and water, which were only established in 2022. and a lack of educational space, which forces migration between ages of 11 and 18. So the mural you see was painted by 2 children on a local school to represent their community, a school that is begun evaluated to closer to the lack of students. In another community, about 25 years ago, there were 30 active herders managing bofedales. Today, only 5 families remain, and those who herd are only women. Men work outside the village or have passed away. One herder told me there are very few men, they almost only accompany. So in Colchane, collective management has shifted from a form of management organized mainly by family lineage and carried out mostly by their adults and women. For some specific tasks, they do call on young family members who live in the lowland cities. However, when we look at the distribution of work in more detail, even though the whole family may participate in these activities like cleaning channels, work, knowledge, and decisions makings are not distributed homogeneously. And to understand that heterogeneity, we need to explore the norms that organize gender and age position in the communities. So from childhood, women join pastoralism and weaving. Many leave school earlier than men. Herding requires daily presence, sometimes 8 hours to go to and return with the animals. And in contrast, men are more connected to irrigation tasks and infrastructure tasks, but their trajectories are more discontinuous. Sons are encouraged to study and work in other activities, and daughters are oriented toward home-linked activities. And marriage reinforces these genders because Aymara communities have kinship structures of patrilineal and patrilocal organizations. So women move to the husband territory. Their belonging is always partial, conditional on domestic and productive performance, working from a young age in a territory they may not inherit. So land property, by contrast, is largely in the hands of adult men. Although inheritance include goods for both, rights over land and productive means tend to concentrate among men, especially the eldest brother, giving them greater power on community decisions. Indeed, in community spaces where decisions are made, authority is exercised by older men. Water turns, representation before the state, or participation in projects are defined at that level. And this produces an organization with the norm is young and adult women sustain a high productive and reproductive load. Adult men concentrate property and authority. Young men's trajectories are interrupted by migration, and other adults concentrate legitimacy. This also organizes knowledge. Women hear daily and know vegetation and livestock behavior in detail. But knowledge tied to property, water rights, and institutional links developed mainly by older men. Everyday knowledge is not always present in the community deliberation. It depends on conjugal or generational positions. That same social organization shapes relations with the state because productive programs requires land title. So legitimate interlocutors tend to be adult men. Institutional relations become masculinized and everyday works becomes feminicized. So the priorities agreed on those relations really reflects the experience of those who herd day to day. But the bofedal has also changed. For example, managed calendars no longer work the same because of change on rainfall intensity and temperature. One key practice, canal constructions, usually carried out in August, has been delayed by 1 or 2 months. As you can see on this photo, that it's really a phenocam image of Andespeed. Some plants remain frozen and water can still infiltrate. So management is decide months later. In summer, rising temperatures declose practices that used to be together. While women previously began herding at 7 a.m. and wove along that way, today herding begins at 5 a.m. Waving, which used to happen while herding, has shifted to the homes. In this way, higher temperatures reorganize herders' days and decouple practices, especially for women, extending their workday. And animals also respond different to these changes. Alpacas depends more strictly on wetland than llamas. When the bufedal loses moisture, household costs increase for families with more alpacas in their herds because they have to buy forage. And so ecological transformations insert themselves into a social differentiation social organization. When ecosystems change, work is reorganized, but authority is also strained. Some young people who migrate decide to return, motivated by ecological changes observed by their grandfathers or grandparents. But even with higher leadership expectations and greater access to resources, generational norms do not always grant them to the same decision-making power at the community level. So in this context, I would like to show you how NDBA-based vegetation cover analysis can open new questions for seeing these ecological transformations. So now I will illustrate both the potential and the limits of NDBI. I want to briefly mention an example from Andespeed. The team developed a time series of bufedal health, as shown in the bar chart, where orange bars indicate dry bufedales and green bars indicate good conditions, and compared it with a draw index, the line in the graph, on the graph, where values above indicate wetter conditions and below indicate drier conditions. So the general pattern was expected. In dry years, NDBI decreases and bufedales become less green, and in wet years, it increases. But there were cases that did not fit. Some bufedales appear greener than expected in the middle of a drought, and others degraded even in years with good water availability. Climate did not explain everything. And there is when the interesting questions open up. Are those greener than expected bufedales during drought the result of more intensive management, or when water is scarce, or management decision that satellite cannot see? And what about those degrade even when it rains, overuse, conflicts, abandonment? The satellite detects the anormality, but it cannot explain it. For that, you need to ask someone who lives there. So as I began to bring this exercise to my own work, a first tension emerged. It's that remote sensing looks at the bufedal from above, over large areas, continuously and seemingly objectively. But everyday management, by contrast, happens on walking the pit. In one specific sector, an NDBI series shows a gradual decline on vegetation cover. From the satellite image, that could be interpreted as degradation due to lack of management. But on the ground, women herders explain that this period coincided with a family agreement of let the bufedal rest. So what the satellite reads as loss, they understood it as care. In other case, NDBA indicate high vegetation productivity, but herders say that was an area dead. Not because there was no vegetation, but because it was an area avoided for grazing because it can make livestock sick. So the satellite measures chlorophyll, but they observe animal behavior and the state of vegetation in daily life. So they are not describing the same phenomenon. And when one of those language gains more authority than other, an epistemic hierarchy is reproduced. So there are also deeper dimensions. Socially, we tend to grant more authority to satellite data than to a situated experience, but a pixel is not neutral. It encodes decisions about what counts as vegetation, which times of the year we observe, depending on the image availability. However, this way of seeing has also limits. In the case of bofedales, NDVA may not distinguish among plant types when vegetation is dense. It measures chlorophyll. But alpacas do distinguish plants. In fact, their behaviors and their favorite food within the bofedal guide decisions about where to build channels or divert water. Therefore, in my work, I do not use satellite to confirm ethnography or vice versa. I use it because this potential to observe large changes at temporal scales that ethnography cannot access. But I use this method iteratively. It's not about deciding which method is superior. It's about noticing that what appears when they do not fit expands our explanation of the transformations affecting bofedales. So now I will close with this diva. I want to mention 3 take-home messages. First, feminist theory has analytical potential that grows beyond describing differences between men's and women's. It allows us to examine how norms produce differences in a first place, and crucially, how those norms are embedded in social ecological relations, shaping what counts as nature, who knowledge is legitimate, and who belongs to a territory. Second, these normalized differences have material consequences. They shape how labor is distributed, who makes decisions, and how ecosystems are managed and transformed. Social norms and ecological outcomes are not separable, they co-produce each other. Third, this matters not only for academic debates. If we do not examine what is considered normal, we cannot see how inequalities are reproduced through environmental governance, and we cannot begin to challenge them. Policies that fail to interrogate normality risk reinforcing existing hierarchies instead of transforming them. So this research began as a question about gender, along the way became a question about differences, and ended up as a question about normality and ecology, about how the two are mutually constituted. But the work is not complete. It remains to examine how these normalities articulate with public policies on buffer management, how racism, class, and territorial marginalization operate within and through normality, and how ecological changes captured through remote sensing may themselves be shifting what becomes expected for each social position. And perhaps one final reflections, as researchers, we are not outside this process. The categories we use, the indicators we choose, the landscapes we decide are worth measuring, are shaped by norms. So part of this work is learning to denormalize our own analytical frameworks. Thank you very much. I look forward for your comment.
Laura, for your presentation. Oh, it is fantastic, and I'm sure we'll have questions and ideas. So again, same, about a workshop, tinkering ideas together. So yes, respectful, constructive, criticism is welcome, as long as it's not about, not understanding and simply diminishing someone else's work. I'll see if any student has a question before you, Patricia and Edu. Maybe I'm looking at you, Adri, just because there are so many connections, but no pressure. I'm thinking about migration, I'm looking at me, but no pressure.
No, it was such a great presentation, such a great work. I really still thinking about everything. I really liked when you brought how the ecological change also changed the dynamics. And I myself working with fisheries management. And for the beginning, I was trying to understand how the formalization of norms, of the formalization of rule, changed the social norms. But then I was stuck how to understand the social norms or the gender norms, and I kind of changing to understand part of this problem of like the visibilization of women's work and the formalization of women's work and how this related with the how the system. But wow, I don't have a question. I just like that's amazing. That's super things to think.
We have to visit you in the
Yeah, we need to talk. We need to talk.
can share more conversation about these terms.
Yeah,
Interesting.
because you, as you said about the ethnography, right? As
Yes.
this method to understand how the social norms are reinforced, replicated, created, and how this is shaping how this management are being established, and then you can map how the other changes, the ecological changes, also are reshaping how this is established, right? So I think the ethnography here is very, very thin, very nice.
Thank you.
Rodri, Patricia.
Thank you. I think thanks for your presentation, and I think the study these bipedals are fascinating. Yeah, I have some questions about the management. You have mentioned several times about the management or collective management or the intensive management. I wonder if you have some more information or more details about what are you saying about management. This is my one question. And the others regarding norms, you could also tell us about the rights of access to these bofedales. And I probably I didn't see or how the community is organized in order to access to these areas, and if it's a collective issue and how they are accessing to this area. Yeah. Okay. Well, I will try to answer this question probably in English, but maybe outside I can. Oh yeah,
Please, sure.
no. I will try, but maybe before we can talk in Spanish of this more properly. But about management, I think I am researching specifically the daily practices, like this is the level of management of communities do, and there are very, very, very diverse. It's not like only a way to make, I don't know, the channels or the rechampeo. It's a process very situated and related to the necessities of the troops and the herds. I think that I cannot answer in English, but the right of access is a little bit more. When we think access, how we are defining access, because what we are seeing with speed is not only property use of the land or the differentiation on gender norms, there is this other process that affects the access to these bofedales specifically in Colchane. So when you do that questions, you bring me to the process of militarization of borders, for example, that we can sometimes not consider this process as affecting the access, but with these herders, specifically in this community that belongs to like 5 families, they have a lot of problems with, not with other members of these communities, but to access to the bofedal because they have new infrastructures and new actors in the territory. So this is one point of access in the field that I do. The other thing is think about these age conditions and the bodies that can effectively access to same parts of the bofedal, because these people has like mostly elders and older herders. They take more time to access what in last years was like in your backyard. You just go to the bufedal near to your home, but today you had to walk like more hours to properly do or find some spaces when the vegetation is good for the pastoralism. This.
You did great. Those are very nice presentations on. So I have a question very similar to Patricia. The impression that I get from the is that all wetlands are managed by communities or have been influenced by communities. I'm not sure that's the case. So I think part of the question is, what is the extent of community management of bofedales in this region? Right, so that's one of the questions that I'll have. Now, connecting your data with remote sensing, I think it would be really useful for you to talk about what are the different types of management, how those different types of managements influence the structure and composition of the land cover.
Yes.
From which then you can connect with remote sensing data. But to make that bridge, you have to describe the management, how it affects the structure and composition, how that may be reflected in physical properties that are captured by the sensor. So making that connection. I think that would be useful in linking the whole thing. Now, the other question is that, and I mentioned to you my reservations about NDVs. But my question is that it seems that you're assuming that the NDVI data that you show is right. It may be wrong. It may be that it's just a poor NDVI classification, or it may be that what it's showing in terms of humidity and non-humidity is not necessarily correct. I'm not saying that it is. I'm just raising the possibility that you are taking that data as correct. And you're evaluating that it's not capturing, what may be happening on the ground. But there is that first order question that is this data correct? So, and to do that, you need, I think, to show or to have maybe from the article that, I don't know, that they did a ground testing and they kind of, have a really clear level of accuracy of what the data show in terms of humidity or non-humidity. So then you can take that and say, well, this may be explaining this result, or this may be explaining that result. But you know what I mean? You need to first certify that that result is correct, because any classification can be completely incorrect.
This is very important. Well, I say that I'm not an expert, but I can say that other students was visiting several points on the altiplano to make the index with the terrain conditions. He did a large work. It takes a lot of time, but it's true. We need to understand the limit, the possibilities of this index. But I also was thinking at this is a simpler index, but I think to work with ethnography and when we want to make iterative conversations with herders, it's very useful to have an index that is simply to be explained with the other organization we were working in the field. And I found this very useful to do dialogues. I don't know how to say it. It's so frustrating. To do never mind. And when we think in the magnitude of this management, well, it's temporarily huge. In Andespeed, we have a temporarily we have seen biochemical profiles of bofedales, and we can see that our management in the Hispanic Times are some papers about it. And I think with the theoretical framework I present today, I cannot say it properly like this bofedal was natural and this bofedal is social, because all bofedales have both dynamics in their configuration. So even now our mining companies planting peat to a form of compensation of damage in this territory. So it's very I get to the I was still thinking in the magnitude of practices, because this is why I say I study community practices, but are other practices that are also managing bofedales. So I focuses only in the practices that develop the communities with I work. Yes.
Yeah, fascinating project. I have a more of a comment than a question, I think. I mean, we're focusing on this particular landscape, but it seems like in your talk, the focus is more on the kind of analysis of norm forming and creating difference, right? So, difference is in your title of the research. And it feels like you're doing a lot in this talk. So, you're kind of navigating the difference between culture and nature, navigating the difference between indigenous knowledge versus scientific knowledge production, navigating gender difference, navigating ecological versus communal difference. So there's like a lot happening in this. So I was just wondering if, I mean, this is of course your PhD research, so and it's so rich, and so I was just wondering, like, if you want to like take a piece of this difference and focus in different chapters, or is it like?
I think it's right. From feminist political ecology perspectives, differences and these binary categories are largely inextricable, intertwined, and I think when I work of gender difference, I'm working on the nature and cultural differences, and I'm working on indigenous and non-indigenous differences. But for that, and to clean the analytical work, it's important the principle I mentioned, that let the field speak, and let hearders guide me to understand what differences were more significant today to the management, to resolve these intertwined differences that can, can we study like forever. So I don't want to do that. Thank you for the question.
Yes.
Thank you, Isaura, for your presentation. I have more like comments and suggestions, right? And or things that I guess I missed in your talk that it's surprising that I didn't see. The first thing is that we know that at least for Andean pastoralists, right, they're transhumans, right, and there's seasonal movement. So nothing there is reflecting that. So to me, it was the impression that because you were emphasizing the norms, and there was you are giving us the impression that the system is like fixed and rigid. And we know that there is it's an interesting pastoralist is interesting because they have some fixed rules, like the communal property, but then you have a lot of flexibility and dynamism internally with committees and little groups that are formed to do things, and they activate and deactivate depending on the challenges. So nothing of that is there. And I wonder if that can make it a more richer and more nuanced image of what is this community and how they are actually implementing these practices. Right? The other thing that I think can be interesting is that, if I understood this correctly, you're moving in the community level, right? And you're talking about community management and community practices, but we also know that a lot of Andean pastoral communities were not really communities, were more, parcialidades from the Spanish, and there was basically individual owners, and they were, so I feeling that if you are emphasizing again the community, you are missing, I would say, the household level. And there's a lot of studies that are showing all the tensions between household and communities. And then in addition to that, you have that not all the households are the same. You have, like, let's say, the rich households, the middle income, and the poor households in these communities. And they also have different positions, different power, different access to different resources. So all that more complicated social map, I don't see it there. So it's giving me the wrong impression. So I think if you bring that, it will allow you to have a stronger argument for how this is happening, how the normalization is much more complicated, and it's a lot of almost like micro decisions that are in tension with community level decisions, or even subgroups within the communities. There are alliances, right? Certain families are allied with others to control water, to access the land, to access the springs, because they are changing too. So that more nuanced reality is, I missed it there, and it will help me see that this is much more dynamic and can respond to environmental change. And thinking on this idea of the household as another unit of analysis, you mentioned proletarization, right? And you are using feminist political ecology. I was surprised not to see that you were thinking more in terms of all these these changes in division of labor, how that is also making the low labor productivity to be, hold and keep for the women, and then young men who are higher labor productivity are being sent to work in the cities or somewhere. But that doesn't mean they're individuals, right? They are part of the household, there are strategies. So really they are sending remittances, the families are probably sending food. So there's a lot of circulation that is really happening, is another way of extracting surplus labor from the women who are providing the care and the base of the social reproduction for the labor force that are working in the city. So it's beyond the community. So I missed that connection, and it was like, oh, why isn't she taking the next step in making that more political economy connection? I think it's right there. We'll talk more about this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all the comments. I think that it's very important to notice that transhuman, there's some changes in the territory. There's a lot of fewer families that do transhuman practices today, because a lot of get drier in other places. But it's true, I think it's very useful, your comments, to think in the community and household connections. And also, I forgot to say that these households moves all the year between all highlands and lowland cities. And this is part important of the distribution of knowledge of young elders and older elders that stays permanently in the territory. So all of this is a great comment for my work. Thank you.
Mention that, and we only gave you 45 minutes, so Thank you so much, Isaura. We ran out of time.